Everybody, to this evening's lecture. We have a double bill on Saving Dudley Zoo with John Wright and Larry Priest. My name is Katrina Byrne and I'm chair of the West Midlands Committee of the 20th Century Society. So this lecture is a combination of the efforts really of the West Midlands Committee and of the 20th Century Society itself. So in the West Midlands, in order to give us something to do during this time, we have been running a lockdown lecture series with the fantastically broad theme of saving 20th century architecture. And that really allows anyone who wants to talk to give a lecture under that, and anyone we want to invite to it can encompass them all. So we started there a month ago. We run it on Mondays once a month, 7 to 8:30, and I started with a talk on saving vitrolite, largely vitrolite shop fronts. Tonight, then the earlier time, we have the double bill, as I said. Then our next one in September is Sian Bradley, who's our Honorary Secretary of the West Midlands Committee, and she's opening a discussion on saving car parks, how you might reuse them, that kind of thing. Are they things of beauty or not? Then in October, we have a talk on the work of Nancy Lancaster. Nancy, of course, was an American socialite, got into interior design through the houses she owned or rented, and dabbled a bit in garden landscaping too, and really was very influential on the work of John Fowler, who developed the style called country house style. Some people would even say he invented it. Anyway, so that's Nancy. Then we're looking at the Sami heritage from Norway. Catherine Jones, our social media officer, was in Norway last year, and I think she was trying to go again this year, but she couldn't. But anyway, she's treating us to that side of things. And then we're all celebrating the prefabs at Wake Green Road in Birmingham and around the country, who are now, believe it or not, 75 years old in December. So they were only supposed to last 10 or 15 years to house people after the war, and here we still have them, very much loved and very intriguing, and also attractive to a wide diversity of audiences as well. So that's our offering. And then we have the National 20th Century Society, who are running their lecture series as a repeat of a series that were very successful in 2017, a style guide to 20th century architecture. So I listened to Alan Powers last week, and that was absolutely fabulous. Then this week we have Elaine Harwood on mid-century modernism. We have Neo Georgian by Alan Powers the week after. Then we have Elaine again doing brutalism the week after that, and then ending up with postmodernism here with Gerard Franklin. So I mean, I think these online lectures are wonderful. I mean, this one I was able to like go out in the garden for a while, listen to it, go upstairs, go around the house, have a cup of tea. Just wonderful. So back to for anyone who doesn't know, the 20th Century Society is a membership organisation, and we're a very active regional group. So some of you might be tempted because of these lectures to join the organisation, and if so, look out for your regional group as well, because we're very active. So these events are free, but we welcome donations towards the 20th Century Society's campaigning at that link there. It's very obvious on the website as well. 20th Century Society is a charity. And for the West Midlands members, we recommend, in line with our usual charging, £5 per event for members and £10 for non-members. Unfortunately, although we all sometimes get this lovely brownie that Catherine makes for us at our events, you'll have to have it virtually tonight. So tonight's programme then, we start off with John Wright with about 30 minutes looking at the Tecton buildings at Dudley Zoo and the local and national context to them. Then we're followed by Larry Priest, who worked on their architectural conservation, and he's going to go through the efforts to save them, which of course is ongoing. I understand the director of the zoo is also, who was director at the time when a lot of the work was done, is in attendance, and we'll follow that with a Q&A session. So slightly longer than normal because of the double bill, but we'll definitely be closing by 8 p.m. Okay, that's me. So let's hand you over to John Wright. So John, I'm going to just stop sharing here, and if you share yours. Is that working for you? John, you're on mute. You're on mute still.
Let me unmute.
There you are. Great, something's happening. Okay, great. Thank you very much. So maybe you just introduce yourself, John, as well, and yeah, run the show there.
Sure. Can you see that, Catriona?
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much for having me, C20 West Midlands Group. My connection to the 20th Century Society goes back some way. I currently sit on the casework committee, but I used to be the caseworker for the society between, I think, 6 or 7 years, between 2004 and sort of 2011. And so my connection with Dudley Zoo goes back just as far. And I'll tell you a bit more about what C20 did to get some of the current works and some of the previous works, what they did to help get it off the ground, to give you some context of where the society's involvement has been over the years. But it's really my job today to set the scene, tell you as much history as I can fit into 30 minutes, run through the structures individually, and then give way for Larry, who'll tell you about how they've been and how they are being conserved for the future. And I think that's a terribly important thing, because it doesn't take you too long to be involved with these buildings and to read about them and their context and their history, to appreciate how vitally important they are as a group of modern movement buildings in this country. I mean, modern movement buildings in collections are rare enough. You know, one could think of the Lascars buildings at Dartington, where there are 13 structures by him, Robert Henning. There are other groups of modern movement buildings by others, Oliver Hill included at Frinton perhaps, but Dudley has something absolutely unique and special. You know, in 12, and originally there were 13, independent structures, which, although they had a strong design unity and even had some of the shared motifs between them, were very site specific to their topographical locations, and saw one of the pioneers of the modern movement, Berthold Lübeckin, and his team at Tecton effectively present the possibilities of reinforced concrete and some of the theoretical ideas behind the modern movement, as far as the European avant-garde was concerned, to the British public for the first time. So they are tremendously important, the buildings at Dudley, and I'll pack in as much history and context and significance as I can, and then give way to Larry, as I said. It's worth reminding ourselves about Lübeckin. He was born in Tbilisi in Georgia, and as I said, he helped to pioneer the modern movement in Britain. He, perhaps more than any other emigre architect, believed that architecture was a tool for social progress, and in 1931 set up Tecton with 6 or 7 graduates of the Architectural Association. There is a picture of them in the early days. Lübeckin's work, and there are about 30 or so Lubeckin buildings in this country, all of which are listed. 12 of those are at Dudley Zoo. All that work, you know, are a sequence of essays in his personal foundation with social betterment, elements of his past, his Russian and Georgian past from a constructivist point of view, and I've added pictures by Lizitsky and graphics by Lurichenko to sort of illustrate that. So he has connections to constructivism, and but more than anything else, perhaps he's driven by you know, sort of philosophical relationship between geometry and space, and the possibility of architecture being used for the improvement of society, all of which would obviously point to him being on the left of the political spectrum rather strongly, and that's certainly true. Here's a competition entry that that he put in for the Palace of the Soviets in Moscow in 1931, and I've added some of those kind of constructivist designs by Lizitsky to sort of make these, you know, fairly simple aesthetic connections to Lubeckin's obsession with geometry, in particular the circular plan form, which we'll see again, but intersecting geometries one way or another kind of define his architecture more than anything else, and particularly his zoo buildings. Zoos had been changing a great deal from their original concept of a sequence of cages or a Victorian menagerie that people went round and stared at animals in, and starting in Germany in the just after the turn of the century, there was a sort of movement that started with Hagenbeck's Tierpark in Stellingen to give animals a more natural backdrop, if you like. We would sort of take that for granted now, I suppose, and you know, we are used to seeing, if indeed we go to zoos at all, we're used to seeing animals' habitats, you know, evoked as close as possible to the ones where they may have come from. But this is a fairly new concept, you know, in sort of 1910, 1911, and that idea to present animals to the public in something like a naturalistic setting was very much in Lubeckin's mind for zoo enclosures. That might be difficult to accept when you have a look at some of the structures, but it's certainly a factor. The genesis of the zoo at Dudley is kind of fascinating. There was a zoological society formed by the Earl of Dudley, who owned his ancestral castle and hill. Here it is, seen from the air in 1955, Castle Hill in Dudley, just outside the town centre. And from contacts at Dudley Zoo, and with Frank Cooper, him of the marmalade fame in Oxford, who had a sort of already ready to go collection of animals that he wanted to move, and a local meat producer called Ernest Marsh. The three of them founded the Dudley Zoological Society, and based on the buildings that they'd seen at London Zoo by Lubeckin and Tecton, hired Lubeckin and Tecton to come and have a look at the site with the possibility of designing enclosures around this hill for the presentation of Cooper's collection. And all this is taking place, you know, in the early 1930s. The penguin pool at London Zoo is 33, 34, and the gorilla house is 35. And you know, a number of problems faced Lubeckin at this site, but not faced him at London Zoo. First of all, he needed to complete all of the structures inside 2 years to make sure that the zoo opened on time in 1937. He needed to argue against the idea that you built animals in a kind of mock medieval castle, which was what was the kind of accepted British model at the time, which had been borrowed from Stirling. And you saw in the previous slide this kind of tumble down stone castle, which was meant, you know, seen to fit in with the 11th to 15th century castle that still sits on Castle Hill in Dudley. And thirdly, there were immense technical and engineering problems presented by the site, because underneath the hill there are a huge network of quite deep limestone caverns. There are basically under that hill a sequence of enormous caves. And there was, I suppose, the added problem facing Lubeckian, and this is one that we would perhaps recognise more, in that, you know, most of these structures were already protected. The castle was certainly a protected monument at that point, and views of it were considered to be important. So Lubeckian actually had a kind of conservation issue, you know, in designing these structures, because he needed to keep open views of the castle from certain viewpoints, and he needed to be mindful of all these other issues too. So it wasn't an easy brief. And in matching the buildings to the landscape, Lubeckian showed immense sensitivity, I think, to the site, and in some cases where the drama of the drop or the ravine was something he could exploit, he did so, and we'll see that with some of the structures. So I'm just going to take you through each of them in turn, because they're worth looking at individually, but it's also worth bearing in mind and recognizing as we look at them. And I'm going to illustrate them with period pictures, not pictures from now. It's worth thinking about the kind of design unity, because it was very rare walking around the hill that you ever got the chance, and this is still true unless they've chopped a lot of trees down, that you very rarely see more than one or two at the same time. So there's a sequence of kind of remembrance when you go to Dudley Zoo, sort of pick up motifs from each of the structures, and it's that sits in your mind as a kind of design unity, rather than being able to, you know, enjoy seeing them all at the same time. I mean, there are tectons, as they've come to be known, you know, completely all the way around the hill at various places. So you don't get the chance to sort of enjoy them all together in that sense. So you pick up the unity by recognition of these repeating motifs that Lubeckian used. It's also worth noting here that they are all listed, and they are all listed in their own right. They are not a group listing. They all have their own separate list description, and they all have their own, you know, specific design history that relates to, you know, the topography and the designs of the time. If you haven't seen them, I'm sure Larry and I will be showing one or two of them. The original drawings by Tecton for the structures are rather exquisite, and we'll show a couple. 6 of them then were animal enclosures, and it was the other structures, the cafes, the kiosks, these sort of support structures for making it an attraction, that we'll look at first. So this is the Moat Cafe, which sits pretty much on top of the hill, and was designed by Lubeckian to house originally an aquarium. And it was one of the 3 eating places that the zoo designed, and it was designed on a site originally not considered suitable for a building because it was so close to the castle. And the plan was constructed with this kind of flowing, almost serpentine curves, which were designed to sort of break up the building's mass from above and from the front. And you can probably see in that picture that the side elevations and the rear were all glazed, but the front was left open to kind of increase transparency and traffic in and out of the building. And like all well, like many of the structures, certainly the bigger ones, and this is one of the bigger ones, it took advantage of the sloping site because this level drops away to the rear to house stores and staff rooms. That's where originally the aquarium was going to be, but they sort of abandoned that. And this building has perhaps, and I've started with it for this reason, it's probably undergone the most change since the zoo opened in '37. And well, I say unfortunately, but for reasons of necessity, the zoo glazed in the curved frontage almost up to the roof line. So all you see there on the left hand side of the roof line is now inside, with a sort of Lubetkin-ish fenestrative detail. And it now functions, and certainly did a few years ago. I don't know, Larry might contradict me here, but I think it functions as the zoo's education centre now. So that was the first and one of the biggest structures. I'm just going to nip back because I didn't talk about this one, but this was the entrance pavilion, and this is obviously one of the listed structures. And when the zoo was built, there was only one possible space really for the entrance, because there are very few places where the hill kind of met the road, you know, at any sort of close proximity. And as zoo numbers were expected to, visitor numbers were expected to be quite high, you know, they needed to design a fairly wide frontage with a number of kiosks so that people could get in. But they also had to present, you know, Lubetkin wanted to present a kind of iconic design at the beginning of the journey, if you like, so that everybody knew what they were in for with these structures. It was kind of an advert, not just for the zoo. Obviously these iconic letters sat on the kiosks next to the turnstiles, and still do. But to give the building some dynamism, Lubetkin used the slope of the site and dropped this S-shaped canopy in a series of waves on these steel stanchions down the hill. You know, they all have slots just set back from the front edge, which you can't quite see in that. You can see on the far left hand there's a sort of a slot in the concrete, and that let light through into the underneath the canopy. And as you know, as you can see, the middle three kiosks were adorned with the sort of iconic zoo lettering. The castle restaurant is the next one we'll have a look at, and this probably was the building that needed to be most sensitive to the castle, because where that photo was taken from is the entrance to the castle kind of compound from the castle gate, looking straight down over the sea lion pool, which we'll come to in a minute, which is either side of this bridge. And again, Lubetkin's using the topography to define not just the appearance but the shape of the building, because on plan it's a huge triangle, with this being the long edge that we're looking at here, giving a dramatic view once you're inside over the steep wooded slopes to the north, which is the direction that we're looking in here. And the restaurant was really the main space for the kind of formal eating in the zoo, and there were two other cafes, the one we just looked at, the Moat Cafe, to sort of provide snacks, but this was the place that you went to sit down and eat. And it was called the Queen Mary restaurant for obvious reasons, because of this kind of bridge-like quality afterwards, but it was originally known as, was now known as the Castle Restaurant. There have been some accretive kind of changes to this one on the inside, but basically the plan form remains the same. And as far as I know, this is not one of the buildings that's been in, you know, particular trouble in terms of its structural detail or whatever. So just minor kind of cosmetic changes. And it really is a central component of the Lubetkin structures at Dudley, because it sort of sits in the middle of everything. there were two kiosks, both of which were very carefully situated by Lubetkin, at the furthest points on the path around the zoo from the other eating places. And they sold ice creams and cigarettes and so on. And both of these were sort of little mini exercises in what Lubetkin developed as something called diametry, which was a sort of a diagonal symmetry around a sort of neutral axis. So the balance of the building, the counter, is balanced by the walls on either side. So there's kind of a symmetry at work that whatever angle you come at the building at, it seems to be sort of symmetrical and balanced around this sort of neutral axis. So they're remarkable little structures, and I believe that Larry repaired one of these. Probably tell you about that. The other one was near the Bear Ravine. I think I have a picture later on for that one. But these structures were kind of another reminder as you went round that this use of reinforced concrete and steel pole, could be employed on the smaller structures and the large, and all these buildings, were sort of poetic or almost artistic exercises in the possibilities of reinforced concrete, and that caused some structural and conservation issues later on, because some of the structures were so pioneering. And it's also worth saying that from very early on in his career, Lubetkin was as much concerned with the concept of the myth of the maker, the builder. I mean, he called his practice Tecton, which comes from architecton, which is obviously Greek for builder. And the people who built Dudley Zoo are really just as important to remember in the history, because most of them were local. Most of the people who did the carpentry for the shuttering were local. Most of the people who poured the concrete were local, even though, the partnership of Ove Arup and Lubetkin at the top, and with Dennis Skinner from Tecton probably going up once a week while the work was while the place was being constructed. Dudley Zoo was built with local labour, and it's quite a feat of imagination to imagine all these black country builders building these extraordinary modern things out of these new materials. Had probably been traditional house builders and traditional carpenters up to that point. This is the final cafe building, the Station Cafe, shown in 1937, and its name came from the proximity that it had to the railway station. And for many people coming in, once you'd seen the entrance gate, this was the first building that they saw. And it's set on the sort of lowest bit of the ground that the zoo enclosure is within. And behind, if you can just make out, is the large brick mass of the cinema that I think still sits behind on the main road. And this one, like the Moat Cafe, was sort of partially open to the elements, so there was that inside-outside, modernist element to it. And the four entrances were each just defined by a sort of very simple concrete frame with a clear story unglazed above, and the roof floating on these stanchions above. And again, like the Moat Cafe, this one got fully glazed later on, and I think some of the most interesting conservation work has been done on this building, and I'll let Larry tell you about that. It's been a number of different things, this building, in its life. It was the Station Cafe, it then became a fish and chip shop, and then it was a nightclub, which closed in 2002, and it now functions as the gift shop. but you can see there that along with the chairs and tables and the snaking bar, there were cages for, there were aviary cages inside as well. So there was a sort of relationship to the zoo's function and where you went to eat. One of my favourites and one of the sort of least sort of recognisable enclosures, if you like, is the sea lion pool, and you can see the castle gate on the right there, where we were looking down towards the castle restaurant from in that previous photo. I mean, these pools, which were designed originally for sea lions, but which ended up housing a number of different species over the years, including dolphins and killer whales, rather unbelievably, were intended to be very inconspicuous because of their proximity to the castle. But I mean, they also provide, sort of a visual link between the old and the new. And Lubetkin had a fight on his hands for some of the structures he proposed, because actually, surprisingly, the conservation lobby in 1935 was quite strong about not interfering with the views of the castle. And here was a modernist proposing entirely new concrete structures right next door to the 11th to 15th century castle. So it wasn't easy for him to get some of these things built, and I think that's worth kind of recognizing that. And to do it, I mean, Lubetkin merged the use of traditional materials. Here you can see the rubble stone wall to the rear of the rather abstract sheets of reinforced concrete that make up the sea lion's kind of basking area, which wrap around the pool and terminate in these kind of viewing platforms. And it's worth noting here, while we're looking at that, that one of the things that dates these structures as zoo enclosures for the modern zoo audience or zoological standards is that looking down on animals is really not done anymore, and is it's kind of frowned upon. We wouldn't build zoological structures like this anymore for the housing of animals because of the stress that is imparted to the animals through looking down on them. And that's one of the factors that defines all of Lubetkin's structures at Dudley Zoo, and it's the one thing that conservation has struggled to overcome, because they're just not suitable anymore for the housing of animals, and that's presented a number of different problems. Of all the structures, probably the most visible from outside Castle Hill is the Elephant House, because you see this from the large roundabout at the bottom of Castle Hill. And it wasn't just built to house elephants; there were camels and Shetland ponies in there too. But because of its sensitive location as a highly visible component, Lubetkin had to keep it low to make sure that the castle could be seen from afar, and he also had to make the frontage as unobtrusive as possible. So in actual fact, this is a structure rather kind of inserted into the top of the hill, with a terrace above that shares a level with the uppermost part of the hill. So you can walk straight from the pathways onto this terrace sort of seamlessly, and underneath, down these two staircases, are tucked away the elephant houses, and there was space out front to see the animals. And in echoing what I was saying earlier about breaking down the barriers between animals and humans in the zoo environment, they were not separated here by heavy bars or anything, but just by a simple ditch and a row of spikes. This building's undergone significant alterations since its completion, but I'll say no more, because I think Larry has a few things to tell you about the Elephant House for the future. But that's one of the structures where you can best see one of these sort of leitmotifs of Lubetkin's I was talking about. You can quite clearly see there the balustrade, which is supported by you know, steel uprights, and that is you can also see it on the balustrading of the staircase, and that you see time and time again on these structures, because it was a place where adults could lean on top of the rail, but children could see through the gap. So there was the ability for adults and children to see the same thing at the same time. And it's a very thin section for most of them, this concrete, and it's one of those things that as you go round you recognise it as a repeating thing. Probably the simplest structure was the, or rather seemingly simple, was the reptile enclosure, and again this echoed this change in zoo mentality to allow you know, the barriers to be broken down somewhat of the cage. I mean, this is just basically an open pit with a slightly lowered section to the rear, where you could see the animals clearly. And here Lubetkin used something that he would use again on the Bear Ravine and on a couple of other structures, the Elephant House included, which is a sort of corrugated finish to the concrete. And again, that becomes another motif as you go round. I'm sure Larry will tell you a bit more about how they replicated that, but it was again one of the sort of motifs of the finish, because you know, Dudley gets a lot of weather and one kind or another, and you know, not all the structures were the same, not all of them had the same depth of cover of the concrete, and lots of the finishes were designed to be different. So that presented a number of conservation issues. And I mean, this structure remains largely unchanged from its original form, and basically serves its original function, except that there are no longer reptiles, there are meerkats in there, that perennial favourite. And I think it suits them very well, because when you go there, the interior of the pit has been raised so that you are sort of at eye level. So that was one of the easier ones, I think, to sort of reimagine as a new enclosure. Well, for me, and perhaps for anyone else who's ever seen anything about Dudley Zoo in the press, there are really sort of two poster boys of the structures at Dudley Zoo, and they are both built for bears of one kind or another. This is the polar bear pit, which is in many ways the most dazzling and dynamic expression of Lubetkin's mastery of the circular plan form. Here on a number of terraced levels, all with this trademark balustrading. You know, it took full advantage of the zoo grounds and the way that the landscape slips, because we're effectively standing on a massive bank here where this photo is taken, looking back into the public gallery, if you like. And so there was a sort of elevated terrace, which you can see there around the top. I mean, you know, as far as zoo legislation for looking down on animals, it just doesn't tick any box at all. But its structural characteristics and its aesthetic appearance is just stupendous. And on either side there were huge curving enclosures built for lions and tigers. So this literally had lions and tigers and bears in it. And despite being renovated back in 2005, complete with the concrete iceberg, which you can see in the middle there, you know, it was just no longer suitable for keeping animals. And while I was at the 20th Century Society, saw a number of plans come and go, including the construction of a giant steel tree in the centre and a glass canopy over the whole thing for housing of orangutans. None of those changes really got off the ground, and as far as I know, this is one of the enclosures that's really, really difficult to reuse. Well, there they are on their concrete iceberg. yes, I mean, the saddest thing for Dudley is that in 1979, with almost no opposition and probably not much dialogue with the outside world, the zoo got rid of one of the most expressive structures that brought together lots of the ideas that the penguin pool at London Zoo had, but also pioneered this idea of being able to watch them swimming underwater. As you can see in the top photo there, they're all viewing windows. I mean, we sort of take that for granted now, but you could see the birds swimming underwater. You could go all the way around this thing, and had this one survived, I think you would have had a slightly different entrance experience, because this sits right behind, or sat, sorry, right behind the zoo entrance. And of course, penguins are lots of fun to see, and I think this was a very popular exhibit for the time that it existed, but the tank underneath never fully worked properly, and the water got into the concrete, and the structural damage was such that the zoo concluded that it was just simply easier to get rid of it and build another penguin pool somewhere else. On a very rainy day in 2009, I went looking for the foundations of this building, and they indeed still do remain. There are bits of concrete and stuff underneath, but unfortunately that's gone. So there were originally 13 structures, and now there are 12 as a result of that. The aviary, and there's the plan which echoes his original or early plan for the Palace of the Soviets, was effectively a tropical bird house. And it had the most commanding, or has the most commanding position of all of the buildings, set on the east of the castle, on an east-facing site with views out of the sort of wooded slopes. You can see the trees behind, and it drops away very, very sharply. And the design of the building was very impressive for its sort of engineering and spatial qualities, and it's probably, in many ways, the most complete example of what Lubetkin's team were capable of delivering. Reinforced concrete roof, and there was a sort of partially inverted cone which was carried on columns, that was actually structurally separate from the main walls, which held the roof. And you can see how that worked partially in this amazing painting. It was done in 1939 by Percy Shakespeare of daily life inside the aviary, which currently hangs in the zoo's offices. And it was kind of flooded with light on the inside, and round the outside all the caged birds sat. And this hasn't been used for this purpose for a long time. And I think the paddock below now has lions in it. But they are not using any part of it. It's really just a backdrop. So that's a bit of a shame in a sense, because it's such a wonderful space inside. And finally, I'll raise the Bear Ravine, because this is probably one of the most dramatic buildings in the zoo, and I think it's probably the most famous, if one were to pick one of the zoo. A huge semicircular terrace set against this dramatic woodland behind. Here it is after opening in 1937. And if you could clear those trees, you could see the aviary beyond, and there's a kiosk. So that's probably the best place where you can see 2 or 3 Tectons together. But standard parapet, Lubetkin's parapet wall, raised up on these at 20-foot intervals on these enormous mushroom columns. And originally the westernmost one was kind of enclosed with a wire mesh to house squirrels, and you can just about see their enclosure on the far side there. And this too, suffered from this looking down issue, because it featured this enormous cantilevered balcony, which you can just see below the upper terrace next to those three trees there, and this amazing S-shaped curved wall, which was a full testament to the ability of the local carpenters who designed the shuttering to make make this thin curving wall which encloses the ravine, which was quite deep, which originally housed bears. There they are, and a bit more detail of the wall. And you can see that the incredible cantilever that they were able to get with this kind of wound steel structure in a U shape, which is supported by those supports on either side. And I'm sure Larry will bear this out, but when we first went to look at these structures, and you stood on the end there and jumped in the air, you could feel the thing flex, and probably still can. Oh, I just wanted to include a picture of the opening day, because it was one of the things that marked out Dudley was that it was incredibly successful. 150,000 people turned up on the first day, only 50,000 could get in. It was a massive success story. And its fortunes, let's face it, 2017 marked its 80th birthday. Its fortunes have come and gone and sort of fluctuated somewhat. And I just wanted to leave this part by drawing to a kind of conclusion what the 20th Century Society did, because I hope, as I've shown you, this is a tremendously important place, and it suffered from some of the conservation, zoological, management, and structural issues that needed addressing all at the same time. Still an operating zoo, still a working zoo, enclosures not fit for purpose, and so on. While I was a caseworker, along with one of the volunteers who's still there, I think David Atwood, we put the buildings forward for the World Monuments Fund watch list, and they were included on it. And that was part of the sort of movement towards getting something done, with the help of the then zoo director, Peter Suddock, who was a tremendously effervescent and sort of, kind of can-do chap who really helped get these things off the ground and get them recognised. And some of the headlines, "Dilapidated animal enclosures of Dudley Zoo given the same protection as Machu Picchu," may have been slightly offhand, but it really worked, and helped to put Dudley on the map a bit. And so the fortunes since then, which I'm going to hand over to Larry to tell you about, have largely been going in the right direction. And I just wanted to point out that 20th Century Society had something to do with that, and it needs to continue to have something to do with that if this really important site is to continue to be restored and loved. So I'll leave it there with Larry, because these 4 structures were the ones that the HLF grant was originally granted for the restoration. And I'll hand over to Larry to tell you about the rest.
Thanks, John. That's great. Can you stop sharing? Yeah, perfect. And Larry, do you want to start sharing now?
Yeah.
Great. Yeah, that's perfect. Oops,
okay.
Yep.
All systems go. Thanks, John, for that. It was really interesting reminder of the context of these buildings in which we're dealing with from a very, very exciting time. I had a call one day. I'm just going to try to, from Peter Suddock, who was the zoo director at that particular time. And he said, as he usually would, "I've got an idea, would you pop in?" I live fairly local to the zoo and had enjoyed Peter's company over a few years before that, where we'd worked with him on creating offices for the zoo, getting to know each other, realise he's a man you follow behind as close as possible, and he leads from the front. Now, his idea was based on a number of challenges. It's extremely challenging to run a zoo, particularly in a town like Dudley. It's extremely challenging to run a zoo with a Grade 1 listed castle, and it's extremely challenging to run a zoo with a castle and 12 listed structures. Peter's idea, which had been all formulated over, he tells me, a walk around the zoo, following with Anne Jenkins really from HLF, and they've been looking at ideas, and John Yates from English Heritage have been not criticising, but encouraging, you know, some repair works to the Bear Ravine, which was in a very, very poor state of repair. But of course, funding was very difficult for zoo enclosures, and HLF didn't apply to animal enclosures. But he walked around, as I say, with Anne, and they concocted this idea of a program of work that would be based on using the structures that weren't necessarily for animals. They were for buildings that would be used by the zoo for other uses. And slowly it formulated this idea that perhaps that was the way forward. We had also the perfect storm where ERDF funding was available to look at a new car park for the zoo, bringing together the visitor attractions of the zoo, the Black Country Museum, the Canal and River Trust. Peter had got this idea because zoos don't have any money. Please remember that the zoos make their money when the weather shines, sun shines. And they do hardly any business during the winter, but that summer season is where they make all of their money. And then they lie fallow again for the winter period. So this isn't a zoo that was awash with cash. It had to be ambitious. Peter was very ambitious. And he said, okay, we're going to have a program, and it's going to be about us doing the best possible job we can to repair 4 of these structures. The ambition was 4 to start with, but we're going to do that in a slightly different way. And he said the different ways that we won't do it how they'd done the previous ones. So the local authority were involved in the repair and conservation of the polar bear enclosure, which was repaired using polymer modified concretes, and then had this overcoating of a very thick cream paint, and looked pretty awful and didn't display much of the characteristics of what we think a Tecton building should be. And he thought we must be able to do it, and it was also paid for on the basis of a square metre rate. So in the way that normal civil engineering work is done, he said, I think we're going to do this a different way. We're going to try and spend some time to work out exactly what the costs are. And we only had, it was £1 million, because that's why we could secure the funding. And so if you keep it under £1 million, we can keep it at a local level. If you keep it under £1 million, we had to then pay for fees, VAT, various other things, and for interpretation. So I think there was a net value of about £600,000 for construction work. Bearing in mind that there was a report prepared by John Allen on the zoo Tecton buildings many years before, which set out a schedule of repair works which ran into several £1 million. So it was ambitious, to say the least, that we were going to undertake. And perhaps we were naive, but Peter and I took us off to get trained up in the use of concrete, and we thought we could conquer the world, and we were going to do this. So we're going to repair them as good as we possibly could. We were going to train a clerk of work. So we're going to use a contractor in day one, but we were going to tell them exactly what we wanted to do. So there was going to be no measuring of works. This contractor would have to estimate what these would cost. Well, we were going to pick his brains, really. So we were going to then train a clerk of works. We didn't quite know who it was. We interviewed several of them, and we were trying to find someone who we could skill up, who could then take and do the future phases of work, because we wanted to train a couple of apprentices from the local college. So we were trying to put a team of people together, because Peter realised that this wasn't just a matter of tackling them once. These buildings needed to be tackled for years to come. So we needed these ongoing maintenance skills. So naively, we set about this, and we devised a program called the 4 Tectons, submitted an application for HLF, which was successful. And we set about looking at the first 4 buildings. I'm going to take you through, some of this is duplicated from what John's already said. But these structures are incredible, and the more you look at them and see them, and the structure the original structure here was incredibly clever. This was actually the project number 3 for Aviary. So it was very, you know, we had the best engineers as well on this particular project. So I've just shown you the tropical birdhouse, the what was known as a castle restaurant, and little details of where this arched entrance comes down and just is the same old little detail with a little scaffold pole diameter tube lifting it off the ground. Very playful and inventive. The Bear Ravine, which you have to remember was set in this limestone quarry, I suppose, big underground caverns that were used for munition storage during the war. And these buildings were romantic, beautifully strong geometric forms. The entrance building that John has already described. The poor polar bear set. And I think I'll go back to that one, because one of the things I always try to remember is we're trying to imagine what it was like, how these buildings were made. And Lou Betkin described his role in the creation of the zoo buildings as designing architectural settings for the animals in such a way as to present them dramatically to the public in an atmosphere comparable to that of a circus. Now that's the complete antithesis of what we really would want to be doing, but you can see how popular these buildings were and how extraordinary it was. One of the small kiosks, the Moat Cafe, as John's already described, the Station Cafe, and I remember Cuddles the killer whale in there in 1974. The Penguin Enclosure, which suffered badly from chlorine attack. So let's go back to thinking what we were trying to understand the setting, I suppose, the context in which these buildings were made. And Peter obviously had very little by way of resources. So we had those black and white photographs. We had some drawings that we'd found, but some were in the RRBA collection, some were in private collections, that showed the drawings at almost 1 to 100 pencil drawings. We knew the contractor and what he'd been doing. And Peter said, we'll put together a team of people, and he said, we will work together. So, and that was really, and it was really working together. So Peter led from the front. He gave us time to develop our ideas, and he was extremely supportive. Brought on board a structural engineer called Stuart Tappin, 20th Century Society caseworker, very knowledgeable, very good engineer. Ourselves, and then we were assisted by Rowan Technologies, who did a lot of the testing for us. So we set off naively and looking back and imagining what these buildings would have been like. And John's already said this great punchline of 150,000 visitors. And just to give you some idea of context, and I stand to be correct on this, but you know, 250, 275,000 visitors in a year now is what happens. So this was extraordinary. And these buildings provided a backdrop to the most up-to-date zoo in the world. You know, these were like spaceships landing here when you think in 1936, 37. We were tackling these 4 buildings. Why were we tackling these 4 buildings? Well, Peter was keen because of the RDF program. The nature of the way that people accessed the zoo was changing. We were probably going to move away from the town centre as being the main entrance. There was a new car park to the south on this drawing, which was going to bring people into what was formerly the Station Cafe. And then we had to tackle the Bear Ravine, but the Bear Ravine was quite important to us as one of the routes up and through the site. It's very steep and hilly, and there's this lovely walk up through, so that was going to be used for a high vantage point, not particularly for animals. Let's try and... So let's have a look at the Station Cafe. Was the first building that we tackled. These are the original drawings that we found, and we never found much by way of anything in greater detail. Found some engineers' drawings. A lot of information when you look very close to them, and I think because of the timescale that John spoke about, from the idea to the zoo opening within a period of 18 months, I think it was almost. And the total cost, I think, was about £40,000 for all of the structures. But these are the photographs we had of the Station Cafe. We had no idea. We had assumed that it was generally black and white, as most people do. They were covered open cafes, and they were built out of concrete. And that was the interior, which had this lovely wavy counter, the columns, the flagstone flooring, the aviary set within the structure. Roof lights above, lovely qualities of light, set against the backdrop of the Hippodrome here where Laurel and Hardy played. And this is what we came across. So when we started looking at the zoo, they'd had the Safari Makeover. So that, what did that mean? Well, zoos make, very little money. They're trying to run a zoo with animals, and these structures had been pretty much unchanged other than being boarded over, painted green. Some had half timbers added to them. And this was known this was a shop. So this was the interior of the shop. Very little clue to what the qualities were of those original buildings that we've just shown you. And part of it had been left open as a store. And this is where we, John said, we had a chip shop, we had a nightclub, very poor condition. This was the counter, or part of what was left of the counter that we saw, that long sinuous counter that used to be there. And this had been nibbled away and broken away as they needed more space to store, goods, cuddly toys. And this was in a pretty poor state of repair. What did Peter do? Well, Peter set out a way of working, really. And what we did enjoy was a good look at the buildings to start with, really. So we were not going to be at the mercy of a contractor who's going to try and measure everything after he'd done it. So that meant us spending time, which was the greatest luxury, with Stuart. And every elevation was identified, and we tried to quantify and get a schedule of rates for every sort of repair that there was. It was really important that we tried to keep within a budget, understood that budget and how that budget was moving as we went through we couldn't afford big overspends. Don't forget, we were trying to tackle this. We're going to do the entrance building. We were going to do the Bear Ravine, which people said was crazy. When the first time I took Grown Technologies there, they assumed that we would be demolishing it. It was in such a poor state. So what did we also started to reveal it. So the first thing we did to have a good look at it was to carefully clean the buildings using water and some soda, but very light techniques. So we could have a look and see what was underneath those layers of paint and boarding, and there were shutters and the rest of it. And the interior was stripped out, it started to reveal this interior, which hadn't been seen like this as one space for a long, long period of time. Columns had been removed, so to make a dancer, area here. A couple of columns had been taken out. Generally, the perimeter roof and wall junction had been infilled. This is the infill brickwork that went between that lower ground wall and the roof that sailed over the top. So as we started to reveal this, and as John said, the original screens were a screen that look out into the zoo. There was no glass in any of these walls. It was a covered cafe. One of the big problems that the building had suffered is that the roof had failed many, many, many years ago. The concrete in all of the buildings is somewhat variable. They'd all suffered badly from carbonation. Were porous, water was getting into the reinforcing and expanding and started to push. So whilst we got that on the outside, and one of the first jobs was to strip the roof and to put a proper new waterproof covering on the roof. The underside, we could see when we stripped away the suspended ceilings, this is what we could see on the underside. So you've also got this problem. So we've got carbonation, we've got water ingress. We've also got very low cover level between the reinforcing and the concrete. So with all those together, you've got these large areas of failing. But as we ploughed on and the building started to reveal itself, you'll see on these drawings, on these photographs rather, where wall sections are being taken out, later infills. We started to expose the columns, and we started to see the colours that were starting to appear, and we're starting to carry out various repairs. And as we took up the floor coverings, we started to see the line of the old counter, which had long since gone, because there was a screed over the concrete flags that were down on the floor were starting to reveal themselves. And for a while, we hoped that we might be able to reveal them. As the more we ploughed on, we realised that large sections had been removed. So ultimately, the solution, then we had to be very flexible and we had great support from conservation architects, was that the way to heat this building, which became the new entrance building. So the zoo was, the new car park had arrived, the entrance into the zoo was changing, and the way in and out of the zoo was changing. So it was about bringing people in a way that they hadn't done before, rather than the external. And people come into the zoo, don't forget, dress for the outside. They come inside very briefly, then go outside again. They come back in when they're wet, and they walk through and go to the shop, and they go out. So we actually ended up using an underfloor heating system. Decided we couldn't conserve, but it was better to protect the concrete flag flooring and put a new underfloor heating system in, which meant we didn't need radiators and all that. So we didn't need any ducting, any equipment on the ceiling, and nothing externally. And that proved to be the best way of keeping the water that people bring in when they're traipsing in and out evaporates quite quickly, and it's quite a comfortable space. One of the problems we had to do was to reinstate 2 columns, which had obviously originally been cast in the junction. So we put in new columns and then took molds from some of the existing columns. And this was the conservation approach. Where we could conserve, we did. Where we didn't, we took a reference from what was existing. And some of the works we just had to leave for someone else to pick up another day. The interesting thing about these was as the buildings were cleaned and all the friable, the paint was removed in areas, we started to reveal the colours that were original. And we knew what was original, and the large flakes of paint that we could take. We would probably have 20, 25 coats of paint. So we got to know quite early on whether those buildings were actually painted or whether they were never painted. And we realized that several of the buildings had never had paint on them at all. So they were working with this concrete color with the fluting that John spoke about against this limestone, which is a very similar color. So very romantic, but the colors were very, very strong. And we carried out a program of works, because one of the challenges was once the concrete had been cleaned, it was relatively porous. We're going to carry out new repairs, and we needed to protect the surface. And we ended in the end using a chyme mineral solution, which we should put pigments in, and we could vary the strength of the pigments, and we could replicate the original colours. And chyme were really supportive with that, and they have a great colourist, and we managed to replicate those colours. So we were carrying out repairs, and there were lots of them to all over the building, and it's a slow, laborious process. So the big idea, as John said, 20th century sited, John and Catherine Croft, very, very supportive of the whole program. And there was a big interest that emerged about trying to carry out repairs using natural mixes, I suppose, not polymer modified. So the intention was here, as much as possible, through analysis we found the aggregate and sand, was to carry out repairs. And so we'd be identifying the depth of carbonation. We would be trying to expose the reinforcing clean oil around it and knock it back. And what I haven't said about this, I suppose, that we started off with a conservation contractor, quite a small local team, good guys. And what occurred to us quite quickly was there was one particular member of their team who lived locally, loved the zoo, grown up near the zoo, was passionate about Tecton buildings. And he became our project champion, if you like, within the construction team. And before too long, we realized that he was the man that was going to become our clerk of works, that was going to train the apprentices and take us into the next phases. Lots of this sort of work everywhere, but you can see how bad they were on on most areas. We were trying to conserve as much of the original fabric as we could, but there were lots and lots of areas where the condition was very poor. These are test samples. And there's a repair, and then we might work with the repair after that to try and do that. But they are quite visible, so you can make out where the repairs are. And we thought that was quite important, to be relatively honest, because you've got some of the aggregate that's exposed now on these corners. And now we start to see the building as it ended up, really. So what we do now, these colours were the original colours, so the bright reds and the blue. The ceiling was white, but other sections of the concrete were left unpainted. The windows were cream. And we put down a stone-coloured floor over the underfloor heating, but the original concrete flags, which are a similar colour, are below that level. A part of the work, of course, is to allow people to interpret, or encourage people to interpret the form of the original building. There's a relatively small section of what was a key part of the design, the continuous bar that snaked through the space. So part of this were replicated. We had to do it. We did it in MDF, and we had to spread the money, and we repaired some sections. And then towards the end, we know that this building was never painted, so it's protected now with a Kime mineral lasure. It has the original colours on the columns. The windows are glazed again, although they were never original. And we had to put in new things like new opening doors, and we had to have this sort of clear story around, which was glass set between the concrete and the underside of the roof, which allowed light in, and the roof floats above that lower story. But as I say, we were surprised. I think most people think that these types of buildings, the modernist buildings, were monochromatic, but we know for sure that they weren't. This is before it got the shop displays in, where you can see the quality of light that it now enjoyed compared to that original image. This is with the shop, the cuddly toys, etc., which is an important part of the zoo's revenue and interest. There's a view here, of course, that was the view that you used to enjoy, looking down the space, and the counter used to, which is shown on the ceiling really, so the counter used to snake through that space. That was the junction between the wall and the ceiling. We had to have a separate space for education use, etc., and interpretation. That was done with a frameless glass screen. Again, we were trying to make the most minimal impact. And we hadn't got a lot of money to spend here. So let's move on to the entrance structure. John spoke about this wonderfully inventive form, really, of a series of wave roofs that allow you to step down the hill, pierced by these scaffold diameter tubes, which we didn't quite know how that worked and how that would fit together. We have these black and white photographs, again, no idea of the colours. We were looking for clues, again, well, how did they build them originally? So we found some images that show the shuttering, and because clearly what had happened here, there had been some fairly substantial settlement in the very initial days from taking away the formwork, which has caused some problems. Again, as found, and I must mention as well that the chairlift which sits behind there also became part of our programme of works, and Jenkins was quite insistent on that. So this is the entrance structure. Again, it had the Safari Makeover of green. We started again to reveal by carefully cleaning to see what colours we could find and what the condition was. Again, we needed to estimate what works would need to be done so somebody could tender for it. There's this settlement, so very little coverage between the reinforcing and the concrete to the underside. Water was getting at the top because this was one of the structures which didn't actually have any waterproof covering above. So they cast the concrete and it was left alone. And John described these slots which bring light in, but we believe what they were for was they actually work like a fascia. So the dust and debris, smog that sits on the top of the roof gets washed off, and generally the bit that was discoloured was the inner face. The outer face generally keeps nice and clean because it's a much smaller collection area. These were in a very, very poor condition. This is where we talked. So the original roofs had no waterproofing layer, and we know that underneath the overhang it was very smooth. You can see the concrete in here where carbonation and pollution had affected the concrete, and water was again getting through to the underside. Again, was this laborious process of trying to identify every repair. And then we started the repairs, breaking out, identifying the loose concrete, the degree of carbonation, looking at the steel work, trying to knock it back. And then slowly coming forward with repairs. The roof was quite a challenge because the roof can be seen as you walk down Castle Hill. So we didn't want to, but we're very conscious of what we might put on the roof of this, but clearly there was a big need to add a waterproof layer. And eventually a product called Kemper was used. So it's waterproofing that's bonded onto the roof, but then it has this stone dressing, and the visual appearance is very similar to the original cast concrete. The underside of these big waveforms, which were white when we found them, rust as you've seen. I remember with Peter one day we were there, and as they were taking off the layers of paint, you suddenly got this absolutely striking blue soffit that was just like the blue sky beyond it. And I think the interesting thing about the entrance structure as well, that we all assume that, okay, well, what was the steel work originally and the gates, all the ironwork? Well, actually it was silver. So we know the first coats of paint were quite a bright silver colour, and I don't think people associate these types of buildings with that sort of palette. So that was the colour of the underside. There was some, we were lucky in many ways. Some of the joinery was still in place, and these kiosks, these turnstiles had been used for many years. The turnstiles had mostly been removed. Some of the original joinery was in place, and there were some repairs carried out. But again, we were mindful of not only where we'd been, what we were doing, but also where we were trying to get to. So our legacy was here. We've got to try and work very closely, and we've got to get to that bare ravine. So we were learning here what we do, because we were very much trying to get towards the big one, which was the bare and the iconic one, as John says. And that was in a really, really poor condition. So we'd spent probably about £400,000 to do this first two buildings, but a bit less than that when we set about trying to tackle the bare ravine. Peter said, let's have a look. So we stopped, took stock. We actually sent out for tender at that stage. We just thought we'd get an idea of where we were and what it might cost to get someone to do it. And we couldn't afford that, because this was a big, big structure, and we were facing this with our clerk of works, a guy called Carlo, got absolutely golden, and two apprentices. One apprentice was falling by the wayside. So we had very limited resources in which to tackle a very large structure. We had the original drawings again. What did we know about it? Well, we had some photographs. So this lovely building sat above these limestone workings, and it was a big ravine. In recent time, by the time we came to tackle it, that had fallen in on itself, so the ravine was nowhere near what it was. We know that it wasn't painted originally, it was left in its natural state, but what it did have that was different to the others was this fluted finish on the concrete. It housed the bears. It had this big cantilever where they used to have the chimpanzees' tea parties. But generally it faced southwest, got very wet, was under the canopy of the trees, discoloured badly. But it was a beautiful structure. And we do know that part of it fell in on itself during construction. So it was supposedly about a third, just over a third bigger than we actually see here. So when we found it, so the ravine had been infilled. You can start to see the condition, very romantic. And I did read a piece before we started this work, and it was a thesis that I think it was a Polish architecture student had written, and it was about the romantic nature of these buildings and should they be allowed to just crumble and fade into the landscape. And it's a really interesting romantic idea, but no, we were going to repair them. So we started to have a look at these structures, and you can see from these photographs the condition that we found. John's already told you, really, you can bounce this up and down, moves very disturbingly. Very wet, very damp, lots of trees above and around, as you can imagine. No protection to the concrete, water getting through the structure, carbonation. This is the cantilevered balcony, and you can see there's a fluted finish which we'll come on to. The bears used to live in these little enclosures under here, and that was the condition that we faced. And that's why David Farrell from Roman Technology said, I think we'll have to demolish this one. And we weren't to be disheartened, and a tremendously inventive structure, really, with these big ropes, steel ropes that helped to hold it up. This fluted finish, which was obviously cast, but it's quite a fine texture, but unpainted with this fine texture against this limestone working, beautiful, and these lovely pure geometric forms. I mean, it was an absolute joy, you know, and it's and what do we know? We knew there's a little pavilion nearby to it, which we're also going to tackle. And this is the little pavilion. We started to tackle that, and we started to clean carefully. And these were used, as John said, to sell ice cream, and there were a little bit of ghost graphics going on. We had one drawing from Ovarup's office, which started to look at details and structure. So we had an idea how it was built. Stuart Tappin, who was absolutely so important to the overall project, his way of working and quiet understanding and analysis. And for a long time, this canopy, this rather cantilevered balcony, we saw little way of resolving it other than to prop it with a small column, which seemed a great shame. And Stuart kept thinking about it, and he'd seen something, he got an idea, and his idea was to use a relatively new process using carbon fiber. And eventually we worked to go out to how we might do that. So this is a proposal to how this balcony would be strengthened, continued with the cleaning, layer and layer of paint, very poor condition. This is the fluting that we could see on the surface, but again, very difficult to clean it, and you end up doing more damage by trying to clean the old paint off. Some of the paint was almost welded to the surface, other was dropping away. But we needed a relatively clean surface because we only wanted to put a very thin layer of this Caen Lazure. Again, we're starting to see some of the colours that have been added. This is what we started to see when we'd taken away all of the loose concrete, and you're seeing the extent of the repair works required. It was pretty daunting. Again, we got, by now we had Carlo, and he got an old mate of his to come along who was a stonemason, and we got an apprentice from the college. And you can see on some of these surfaces, but the only pattern we got to work with were these very small areas. And at that stage, we obviously, for a while, we didn't know whether the surfacing, this texture had been added because of the curved nature of these surfaces with a float, or whether it had been cast. And we actually believe it was cast in situ. We couldn't obviously do that, so we had to spend a fair bit of time trying to replicate that finish. These are a bit disjointed, these. So when I talked a couple of images ago about the carbon fiber reinforcing, that's all that it takes. So there was some carbon fiber was bonded to the underside, and there was some carbon fiber, very thin, that were bonded to the top. And that actually stiffened up the balcony. And now you can bounce it. It tremors a little bit, man of my size, but other than that, it's not too bad. So this was the underside where we thought we were going to have to prop. Again, very poor condition. this was the careful process of really, it was just removing lots of this very, very poor quality. Junctions between steelwork and concrete was always a problem, where water had got into the top of the column and corroded. And this was this whole process of how do we do it. So Carlo, you know, most of his own time and constantly thinking about it and practicing and skilling, we were molding from the existing, we were making floats and trying various practice pieces to see whether we could replicate this finish. So the concrete, the loose concrete was removed, reinforcing, exposed, treated, pushed back as far as possible to get some cover to the concrete. And then we would start a process of applying the mixes, and then with skill, bringing those wood floats you've just seen, starting at the top where we could align it and try and bring it down and recreate the finish. I don't pretend it's perfect at all. It's sound, it replicates very much the original. And I think it was a very good effort, but I don't pretend that it was absolutely perfect conservation. It's an extremely difficult process. But you can see there, I think that's a very good job, but it's very difficult to do by hand. And there was a lot of it. So the lot of it also included casting new sections of handrails, because we were literally left with just bits of metal poking in there. The handrails had gone. So new sections of handrail were cast. Various tops again exposed, same old process. Lots of, you can imagine, everywhere we looked, there was these years and years of neglect, because this is a zoo. This is not a museum of Tecton buildings. But repairs were carried out and colours reintroduced. The same Kemper treatment to the upper part of the Bay Ravine, again to protect these soffits. So that's the Kemper finish, which is waterproof. There needs to be a process, generally cleaning and maintenance, which I think is challenging for the zoo because of all the other demands that they have with regard to looking after the animals and a Grade 1 listed castle. This is the application of the Kime sealant, and then we started to see the Bay Ravine in its final setting, and looks quite handsome really. And you can see here, it's, as again, we didn't want it to look like new. You can see where it's been repaired, but I think generally it's sound condition. We know this one was painted light blue after a few years because it was discoloring, but we decided not to go with a light blue. Again, the Kemper finish on the Cantilevered Balcony now, which is fine. Handrail restored. And the little kiosk that sat, so this was unpainted in the background, the Bay Ravine, but the little kiosk against it enjoyed these lovely bright colours. And that's it. And what do I have next? Well, going forward, I think we are, I'll take it off the black screen, that's not a nice thing to look at. So in recent months, in the recent month really, we have been successful in getting an award from the Getty Foundation to take some of the things forward, the skills forward, to look at tackling the remaining structures. Now that funding doesn't allow for any of the construction work. Well, what it does allow us to do is to update and develop the conservation management plan to prepare detailed proposals for each of the structures so they're oven ready. And often funding opportunities come along where the zoo needs to be ready to take advantage of that. So there's going to be a process now of tackling those remaining structures that we spoke about earlier, the tropical birdhouse, the elephant house. We'll see. So that's where we are. And what I suppose the thing to add is that we managed to do this within the budget for the 4 Tectons, and did go on to tackle the sea lion enclosure and the meerkat enclosure, which were all completed within that very modest budget, because I think of the way that it was tackled. So this was about not doing civil practices, we had to, of course, it relied on lots of goodwill and lots of effort from the people who involved, who gave up lots of time. I was passing David Platts, who was a project architect, every day. We lived nearby, and we would be able to call in. Peter was always there, so he was running the zoo, but also running this program and driving from the front. Carlo and his team of people, Stuart Tapping, lots of people gave lots of effort to make this happen, and I think that's really important, you know. So anyway, that's where we are.
Thank you, Larry. That was wonderful. I mean, I'm so proud that we have these structures in our region. So there's just a couple of questions there. One is that although you say it's a zoo and not a museum of Tecton buildings, it is actually very much both in the view of this participant. So what is the attitude of the zoo in general to having half their size occupied by empty enclosures?
It's a very good question. I think they're probably unfortunate, half of them, because they're still in a very, very poor condition and dilapidated. I think they're very proud of the structures that have been completed, and I think there's a growing appreciation and there's an interpretation, so that's gained through the new entrance into the zoo. There are a number of plaques adjacent to each of the structures which try to give some background to the context. And of course, some of the buildings do have, the ones that we've tackled, they do have uses. This is the only one that I think might again have animal enclosure, but it was very much part of a route that would allow you to go from the lower level of the zoo up through a staircase here and then up to the higher levels of the zoo. The entrance building and the old entrance building and the station cafe very much function as part of the new zoo, and people enjoy them and see them every day. But I'm not sure. I don't know whether, John, you could add into that, or whether you had any thoughts.
I can say something from a kind of historical perspective. I mean, I think it was fair to say that when C20, you know, first went up there, when I first went up there with Catherine and others, you know, the opinion of them from the zoo's perspective was rather more that they were a sort of quasi liability. There was no clear route to them being an asset that the zoo could see at the time, and you know the 10 years that followed that, you know, pretty much saw that turned around. I think the first phase of works that you did, Larry, were, you know, an indication for the first time since they'd been constructed that the Tectons had a life and a purpose beyond that which they were originally constructed for, and furthermore that work proved to the zoo that they could be an asset. So that book then came out that was written by somebody who worked at the zoo, and so, you know, you start to layer these things together, and you know, the sort of the metaphorical oil tanker of opinion in the area to turn in favour of the Tectons. I mean, I would sound a note of caution that they're obviously not out of the woods yet from a conservation perspective, and you know, you might say that, you might compare that with you know, the current condition of the Elephant House at Whipsnade, for example. The only one of Lubeckin's zoo enclosures that's, you know, that's remained in pretty good nick all the way is the Penguin Pool at London Zoo, and I'm sure, you know, regional groups of C20 would cry metrocentrism about that. And you know, there is some element of truth, I think, in the fact, unfortunately, that, you know, the buildings being where they are and the difficulty in getting to them, you know, frankly took international attention to draw everybody's focus on them. But the story has been positive ever since.
Yeah.
So another question has come in. Will the Bear Ravine have a new use? Do we know?
My understanding is, Derek Grove is the current zoo director, and they've had, you probably see them on that photograph, that there were some emus in there at that particular time in the lower, like the pasture area, and I think that they're going to try to put brown bears back in. So I think this one may work as an animal enclosure. What it's good is a vantage point, really, to get up. Not great for looking down on animals, which I think was always frowned upon in recent times. So But what this could do is fulfil a really important function as I keep saying, a route up through, because it's very difficult. You have to have good legs to get up and around Dudley Zoo. It's a hard hike. And there could be a more interesting way, and there's quite an interesting vantage point. So I'm not sure is probably the right answer to say. I think there's an ambition to, but of course it's a challenge with all of the structures to find uses for them going forward. And to get funding, nobody wants to fund animal enclosures.
Lots of praise coming in there, praise for the talks, but also about what has been achieved there. There's a question perhaps for John on, were there other proposals by Tecton for that zoo that weren't implemented?
Not that I know of. I mean,
yes,
I think
John, yes. I asked you a question about. We think there was some large
signage.
Yeah.
Well, so there may be there may be. I've said, if anybody out there knows anything about this, indeed, if John Allen is watching, we'd be grateful to know. But we think, Larry and I, that back in the distant past, we've heard something about there being signage for each one of the enclosures that were designed by Lubeckian. I mean, it's worth saying that if it's not in this book by John Allen that I've been hastily reading up on today, then it probably isn't so. But yeah, I mean, that's something we may find out. As for enclosures themselves, the speed in which these were designed and went up, and the moderately good, historic record that was left behind by Kia and Tecton, and which was collated by the zoo as part of the HLF project, and the archive now resides at the zoo, I think, doesn't reveal any other structures that we know of.
No.
Okay, and of course somebody is saying here that it's another thing to put on the long list of 20th century sites to go and visit, which we all have that problem.
Yes.
Right, okay, I think because I've allowed it to run over to take some questions, we might draw it to a close here. Apologies, we have run over. I did tell the guys not to whiz through because you can speed up teaching online. Oh, Peter Suddock is there, the director of the zoo during the time when Larry was there. Peter, did you want to have any comments made?
Yes, two or three things.
Yes.
One, that the worst signage produced some drawings, and they were of the animals, I know, lion, tiger, and everything else, and the word lion or tiger. And if you look at the shop, the word zoo down the middle of the shop was done for the sole purpose to try and reproduce that original thinking. The other thing is, this project was done where these buildings had a purpose and a project. And if you go back to when John Allen did work and previous work, the schemes are put together, but the buildings have to have a purpose. And if they haven't got a purpose, it's an onus on the zoo to support a site now of UNESCO importance as well. And that's a tall order for any zoo to run. They struggle, not struggle, zoos do well in the main, but to support the building structures as well as trying to run a conservation project is very, very difficult, if not impossible. And by making putting all the restrictions around it, UNESCO sites and these sort of things, you might lose the tenant in the process if you're not careful.
Thanks, Peter.
I think one of the things that marks this out as a conservation project, and Larry made a sort of apology for it at the end, but I really don't think that's necessary. I think the conservation work here, one of the most important driving forces of it was that it was revisiting, reimagining and restoring some of the skills that built Dudley Zoo in the first place. Some of those craftsman skills that Lubeckian put at the centre of his original designs, and the local people that built Dudley, by and large, have restored bits of Dudley. That's tremendously important.
Yeah, I think we're Peter and I and Stuart, we're all very proud of what was achieved, really. Although, as I say, part of me does think, well, actually, it's not fantastic. But actually, the main thing is it happened, and we shouldn't underestimate that, how difficult and how ambitious it was for the zoo to tackle this program in very difficult times, where the zoo has been on. Peter can tell you more than I, how close to closure the zoo has been over the years, and it's been a very difficult, and to tackle something like this as well. With Peter and you said that the zoo, it was Jill, his wife, who wrote the book that again helped with this publicity to try and generate interest and support, which were really key parts really. So it was everybody chipping in and then pulling together. And that's what it takes often, isn't it? It's just that extra bit of, let's have a go at this. We've got a chance to do something really unusual here. Let's have a go.
There's one expert question has come through, I can't let go, and it's from John Allen saying that in their report of 1990, done in consultation with Lebekian, that they drew attention to the number of additional structures that had accumulated on the site over the years and cluttered the landscape. And he's asking, was anything being done with those, or any plans to reduce them, take them out?
I've no idea.
Okay. Yeah.
I don't know, to be honest.
Those structures were there to support animal conservation and the keeping of the zoo that generates the money to maintain the site.
Yeah.
So it's a catch-22. If you remove those, then you remove the animals that go with them, and therefore you remove the purpose of the site as a zoological collection, and therefore the visitor numbers will decline and funding becomes less available. It's simple as that. But where structures have been added in my time, you know, we did work really hard to make sure they sat alongside the original building in such a way that they didn't overwhelm them or diminish them, that they were in keeping as far as possible.
Great, thank you, Peter. That insider view is very illuminating. I mean, sometimes from a conservation point of view, it's quite useful to have other buildings that you can trade off in time to achieve better results. So you get that, you know, you get that balance between benefits of removing some of them and then in favor of another one. Oh, Larry, you mentioned a play barn, a controversial play barn proposal. Do you want to tell us about that?
No, I think the zoo is constantly having to think how it brings revenue and people to the zoo. And I've got an opinion on this. I'm sure Peter's got an opinion on it. And the idea of barns, they've got some hay barns there for foods and whatever. And the idea was to bring another barn. The trouble is the zoo is also thinking about going forward, what does it become? So the zoo's got some really key questions about what is a zoo like, you know, in this part of the 21st century. What will be acceptable? You know, is it acceptable to have giraffes in a? And I don't want to get into this argument or anything, but Peter and I are fascinated by his thoughts as to what a zoo could be, and what, you know, generally we've seen zoos that might be sort of focusing on one particular species and becoming really good at that. You know, the zoo's got to decide, I suppose, going forward, what is it about? What does it offer? You know, what sort of animals will be there? And they're constantly trying to find revenue. And don't forget, as I say, the zoo is part of an equation, but there's also this medieval castle, which is fantastically interesting, and Tectons, and the great limestone caverns, and the fossils. I mean, the fossils around here, you know, Limery's got nothing on this place. You can go up to a wall and just pull fossils out of the wall. You know, it's got a tremendous offer. And it's a matter of working out what does it become, and especially if it can. Peter was always keen. What does it do if it combines with the Black Country Museum and the visitors too? It becomes a place where you might visit for 3, 4, 5 days rather than one day or half a day.
I think they've now achieved UNESCO status on the geopark because of the geological wealth there as well. Okay, I'm going to call it to a close there. We had, I think, 87 attendees at the height, and we still have 55, which is remarkable. There might be some rumbling tummies there. So I just remind you again, if you have enjoyed the talk, to look at the website, the 20th Century Society website, and please make a donation. It's really useful. You can see how much the work of the Society has achieved in Dudley Zoo in bringing it to the attention by putting it on an international stage, which then just highlighted it on a national and regional stage. So all that work can't be done without your generous donations. And just thank you very much to our speakers again, Larry Priest and John Wright, and I'll give you a symbolic clap
You're
from
welcome.
everybody. Thank you very much. That was wonderful. All right, everybody. Bye-bye. See you at the next ones, we hope.
Thank you, Katrina.
Bye.
Bye, Larry.
See you, John. Bye.
Bye, Peter.
Bye, John.
See you, Peter.
Nice to hear you.
Yes, Larry.
Yeah.